On the morning of August 4th, 1892, in the quiet mill town of Fall River, Massachusetts, the unthinkable happened. Andrew Borden, a wealthy businessman in his 70s, and his wife Abby were brutally murdered inside their own home. No signs of forced entry. No strangers spotted fleeing the scene. Just two lifeless bodies in a respectable Victorian house on a summer morning. And almost immediately, suspicion fell on someone close. Someone respectable. Someone who, in the eyes of society, should have been incapable of such violence. Their daughter, Lizzie Borden. It's a question that has haunted Americans for more than 130 years. Could a refined, church-going woman, dressed in the stiff collars and starched skirts of the Victorian era, truly have picked up an axe and slaughtered her own family? This is not just another crime story. This is one of the most famous unsolved mysteries in American history, a case that split public opinion then, and still sparks debate now. Lizzie herself was put on trial for murder in 1893. The jury acquitted her, but the verdict didn't restore her reputation. For the rest of her life, she lived under the shadow of suspicion. The story of the Borden murders is not only about blood and suspicion. It's about class tension, gender expectations, and the image of a proper lady, in the late 19th century colliding with the horror of violence. It's about the way society chooses to believe, or refuses to believe, that certain people are capable of terrible things. And so, the case remains officially unsolved. Historians and true crime enthusiasts continue to argue over the evidence, the inconsistencies, and the unanswered questions. Who really killed Andrew and Abby Borden that morning? Was it Lizzie, cold and calculating? Or did someone else slip through the cracks of history? Today, in this episode of Cold Case Files, the Lizzie Borden Axe Murders, we'll walk through the story together. We'll use reliable sources, court transcripts, reporting from the time, and respected modern histories like Smithsonian Magazine, History.com, and Arnold Brown's book Lizzie Borden, The Legend and the Truth. Whenever we discuss theories that remain unverified, I'll make that clear, so you know what is fact and what belongs in the realm of speculation. And as we go, I'll invite you to reflect, to form your own conclusions. Do you think justice was served? Or did the truth slip away forever in the summer of 1892? To understand the mystery, we need to step back into the world of the Bordens themselves. A prosperous but frugal family, living in a town divided by wealth and class. So let's begin where every mystery should, by meeting the people at the heart of the story. To really understand the Borden murders, we need to step back into the world of Fall River in 1892. Imagine a booming industrial town in southern Massachusetts. Its skyline dotted with textile mills, and its streets alive with workers in wool coats and long skirts. Fall River was a city of contrasts. On one side, wealth and respectability. On the other, working-class immigrants struggling to make ends meet. The Borden family sat somewhere in between. They had money, plenty of it, but they didn't flaunt it. Their house on 2nd Street was comfortable but plain, built on the wrong side of town according to local gossip. Many of Andrew Borden's peers, wealthy men with old family names, had moved to the Hill, an upscale neighborhood filled with grand Victorian homes and leafy streets. But Andrew stayed where he was, in a modest house without plumbing on every floor, even though he could easily afford better. Andrew Borden was 70 years old that summer. By all accounts, he was a strict, frugal man who built his fortune carefully. He started with furniture making, moved into real estate, and eventually became president of a local bank. Some neighbors admired his discipline, while others whispered that he was miserly, unwilling to spend money even for his family's comfort. His wife, Abby Borden, was 64. She had married Andrew after his first wife died, when Lizzie and her older sister Emma were still young. As stepmothers often did in Victorian households, Abby occupied a complicated position. Some accounts describe her as a practical, steady woman. Others suggest that Lizzie and Emma resented her, seeing her less as a mother figure and more as an intruder who benefited from their father's wealth. And then there was Lizzie herself. She was 32 years old in 1892, unmarried and still living at home. A common situation at the time, but one that placed her in a strange position. She was neither a girl nor a wife, and society didn't offer many roles for an independent woman of her age. Lizzie devoted herself to the church and was active in charity work. Friends described her as refined and well-mannered, though sometimes strong-willed. But inside the Borden household, tensions simmered. One of the biggest points of conflict was money. Andrew had begun transferring properties to Abby's relatives, something Lizzie and Emma saw as a betrayal. They worried that their stepmother's family might inherit what they felt should rightfully pass to them. Arguments broke out, and by the summer of 1892, Lizzie and Abby reportedly weren't even on speaking terms. Yet it's important to note, despite these family tensions, there was no history of violence in the house. Disagreements, yes. Cold silences, absolutely. But nothing that predicted the shocking events of August 4th. When news of the murders broke, the social fabric of Fall River seemed to rip apart. For the Victorian public, the idea that a woman from a respectable family could be involved in such a crime was almost unthinkable. Women were seen as delicate, moral guardians of the household. Violence, especially something as gruesome as an axe killing, belonged in their minds to men. This is part of why the case became such a sensation. It wasn't just about who killed Andrew and Abby. It was about challenging assumptions of what women could or could not do. And I'd like you to imagine yourself in that world for a moment. Picture being part of a wealthy family that chooses thrift over luxury. Living in a house that feels respectable on the outside, but tense and divided on the inside. Picture being Lizzie, 32, unmarried, bound by duty, and feeling your future slip away as your stepmother's family gains favor. Can you feel the strain that must have hung in the air? That strain was about to erupt. Because on the morning of August 4th, 1892, everything changed. Arguments over money and family tensions gave way to a shocking act of violence that still puzzles historians to this day. So let's move from the background into the timeline itself. The morning when the Bordens' carefully controlled world shattered forever. By the summer of 1892, tension inside the Borden household was high, but the day of August 4th began like any other. The house on 2nd Street was warm, the air heavy with the kind of heat that makes tempers short. Inside lived Andrew, Abby, Lizzie, and their maid Bridget Sullivan, who was in her 20s and had emigrated from Ireland. Emma, Lizzie's older sister, was away visiting friends. The timeline of that day is crucial to understanding why this case still grips us more than a century later. Sometime just after 9 o'clock in the morning, Abby Borden went upstairs to make the bed in the guest room. Her husband's relative had stayed the night, and the room still needed tidying. While she was doing this ordinary chore, she was attacked. Later medical reports suggested she was struck multiple times with a sharp blade, most likely a hatchet or small axe. Abby's body was found face down on the floor between the bed and the wall. The time of her death was placed around 9 a.m. What's chilling is that life in the house continued for nearly 2 more hours before the second murder took place. Andrew had gone out early, as he usually did, to run errands around town. He returned home sometime before 11 a.m. He wasn't feeling well, perhaps because of spoiled food the family had eaten the night before, and he lay down on the sofa in the sitting room to rest. While he slept, someone approached and delivered fatal blows to his head. His body was discovered still on the couch. His morning nap turned into a crime scene. The discovery unfolded quickly. Around 11:10 a.m., Lizzie called out for Bridget, the maid, saying that her father had been killed. Bridget rushed into the sitting room and saw Andrew's body. Soon neighbors were summoned, and police arrived shortly after. When they searched the house, they found Abby upstairs. The horror doubled. 2 murders committed in the same house, just hours apart. From the very beginning, certain details puzzled investigators. First, there was no sign of forced entry. The house was locked, and nothing suggested a stranger had broken in. Second, nobody reported seeing an unknown figure coming or going. If an outsider had committed the murders, how had they entered the house, killed 2 people at different times, and left without being noticed? And then there was Lizzie's role. When questioned, she claimed she had been in the barn looking for fishing sinkers around the time of her father's death. She also mentioned that she thought her stepmother had gone out to visit a sick friend earlier in the morning, which is why she wasn't concerned about not seeing her. But Abby's body was upstairs all along. Another puzzling detail was the lack of blood evidence. Both murders were brutal, but Lizzie was not found with blood on her clothes. Her dress, by reports, appeared clean. Investigators wondered, could she have changed outfits and hidden the bloody clothes before anyone else arrived? Later, a burned dress in the Borden home would become part of the controversy, though Lizzie's defense insisted it was an old garment destroyed because of paint stains, not blood. The supposed murder weapon also raised questions. A hatchet head was found in the cellar, separated from its handle. It was clean, too clean, some thought. Was it washed after the crime? Or had it never been used? No conclusive proof ever tied that hatchet to the murders. Think about the strangeness of this scene. Two people killed in broad daylight in a busy town, with family members and a servant present in the house, yet no one saw or heard anything clear enough to explain what happened. Doesn't that leave you wondering whether the killer was someone so familiar, so expected in that house, that nothing seemed out of place until it was too late? By early afternoon, word spread across Fall River. Crowds gathered outside the Borden home, shocked that such violence had struck one of the city's wealthiest families. Reporters swarmed the scene, scribbling notes for headlines that would run across the country. Within hours, suspicion began to focus inward, not outward. This sequence of events, Abby's death in the guest room around 9, Andrew's death in the sitting room just before 11, Lizzie's discovery of her father, Bridget's alarm, the neighbors rushing over, and the police finding Abby's body upstairs, formed the backbone of the case. Yet every detail seemed to raise more questions than it answered. Why did no one hear the struggle? Why was Lizzie's account of her movements so uncertain, changing slightly with each retelling? And perhaps the most haunting question, if she didn't do it, who did? These uncertainties shaped everything that came next. Investigators would soon zero in on Lizzie as their prime suspect, but in doing so, they would leave behind other possibilities. And that's where the mystery deepens. So as we step into the next part of our story, keep these questions in mind. Two people were dead, the house showed no sign of a break-in, and the only people known to be present were Bridget and Lizzie. With that, the focus of suspicion narrowed. The question became not just who had the opportunity, but who had the motive. Let's move now into the investigation and the long list of suspects, though one name quickly rose above all the rest. When police arrived at the Borden home, they faced a puzzle that looked simple on the surface and proved stubborn underneath. Two victims, a locked house, a handful of people who might have heard or seen something, yet couldn't give the kind of clarity investigators needed. And almost immediately, attention settled on the person closest to the scene, Lizzie Borden. Why Lizzie? Partly because of logistics. If there was no forced entry and no clear intruder, suspicion tends to move inward. But there were other reasons. From the first interviews, Lizzie's timeline sounded uncertain. She said she'd been in the barn looking for fishing sinkers shortly before discovering her father on the sofa. She also thought her stepmother had gone out earlier that morning, even though Abby's body was upstairs the whole time. As officers rechecked the house, these details didn't sit comfortably. Still, suspicion is not proof. And the early investigation, by modern standards, struggled. The scene wasn't sealed the way it would be today. Neighbors and curious onlookers came and went. Potential evidence was handled, moved, and sometimes put back out of place. Forensic science, in 1892, was rudimentary. No DNA analysis, limited understanding of trace evidence, and few standardized procedures for preserving a crime scene. If you've ever wondered how a case like this could stay unsolved, start with the tools they didn't have. As detectives searched the cellar, they found a hatchet head with a broken or missing handle. It looked to some suspiciously clean. Was it scrubbed? Or simply unused? No test at the time could give a definitive answer. Meanwhile, family tensions emerged. There had been arguments over money. Andrew had given property to Abby's relatives. Lizzie and her sister Emma believed that decision threatened their financial security. Motive is not the same as guilt, but it gave investigators a story to test. Then came a string of details that fueled public debate. A local druggist later claimed that, the day before the murders, Lizzie tried to purchase prussic acid, hydrogen cyanide, allegedly to clean a sealskin cape. The prosecution wanted this to imply planning. But at trial, the judge excluded that testimony, so the jury never heard it. A few days after the murders, Lizzie burned a dress in the kitchen stove. A family friend, Alice Russell, witnessed it and later testified that Lizzie said the dress had paint stains. To the defense, this was housekeeping. To the prosecution, it looked like evidence disposal. There was no way to prove either explanation. Ask yourself, if you were on that jury in 1893, what would you make of these fragments? A possibly cleaned hatchet, a burned dress, an attempted purchase of poison you weren't allowed to consider. None of it anchored by blood on Lizzie's clothing, fingerprints on a weapon, or a reliable eyewitness. The grand jury indicted Lizzie, and the trial opened in June 1893, moved to New Bedford to reduce local bias. The courtroom featured some of the era's most notable legal figures. The prosecution was led by District Attorney Hosea Knowlton. Lizzie's defense was headed by George D. Robinson, a former governor of Massachusetts, alongside Andrew Jennings, the family's attorney. The stakes were immense. Newspapers framed it as a moral drama, the respectable daughter against a monstrous accusation. In court, the state leaned on circumstantial evidence and inconsistencies. They pointed to the tight timeline. They highlighted the dress burning. They questioned Lizzie's changing statements. But dramatic moments don't always translate into proof. Police searched the barn and the house repeatedly without finding a blood-stained dress or a clearly bloody axe. There was no testimony placing Lizzie at the scene at the exact moment of either killing. And when the state tried to use Lizzie's inquest testimony, the judges ruled it inadmissible. She had been questioned without formal counsel and while medicated for shock, which raised concerns about fairness. There was one notorious moment. The prosecution presented the exhumed remains to illustrate the injuries. Accounts say Lizzie fainted, an image that would echo through the press. But even that spectacle did not supply the missing link between suspicion and certainty. After closing arguments and careful instructions from the bench, the jury deliberated for roughly an hour and a half. They returned with a verdict of not guilty. Lizzie Borden was acquitted. You might be thinking, if she was acquitted, why does her name still cling to this case the way it does? Part of the answer lies in public opinion. Acquittal is a legal endpoint, but not always a social one. Many in Fall River and across the country couldn't reconcile the brutality of the crime with the image of a proper lady. And that tension kept the story alive. Some believed the male jurors of the era, steeped in Victorian ideals about femininity, simply could not picture a woman committing such violence. Others argued the state's case was too thin, the investigation too flawed, and that the jury did exactly what it should have done, refused to convict without proof. What about other suspects? Bridget Sullivan, the maid, had a practical alibi. She was washing windows earlier, felt sick, and was resting in her attic room around the time Andrew was killed. Police questioned her thoroughly and never charged her. Emma Borden, Lizzie's older sister, was out of town and remained out of the frame. John Morse, Lizzie's maternal uncle, had visited the night before and left that morning. He gave a detailed account of his movements, which witnesses corroborated. Over the years, writers have floated the idea of a mysterious intruder, someone slipping in through an unlocked door, perhaps hiding upstairs. That remains speculation. There was no hard evidence of a break-in, and nothing was stolen. Let me be clear about what is verified and what falls into historical conjecture. It's verified that the house showed no signs of forced entry, that a hatchet head was found in the cellar, that Lizzie burned a dress days later, and that a druggist claimed she tried to buy prussic acid. But that claim never reached the jury. It's conjecture to say Bridget was involved, or that a stranger committed the murders unnoticed. Those ideas lack confirmed evidence. They persist because people try to fill the gaps that the investigation left open. Fast forward to the modern era. If today's forensic tools had been available, DNA tests, luminol trace analysis, would the case be solved? It's a tempting thought. But as of 2025, there has been no accepted forensic breakthrough that resolves the question. Some artifacts survive in historical collections, and the case remains a favorite for armchair detectives. The Borden house itself opened to tours in the 1990s. By 1996, it was operating publicly as a museum-like attraction and later as a bed and breakfast, keeping the story in the public eye. In 2018, the film Lizzie, starring Chloe Sevigny and Kristen Stewart, reintroduced the case to new audiences through a dramatized lens. None of these cultural moments, however, have produced definitive proof. So where does that leave us? With a case that balances on the knife edge between opportunity and reasonable doubt. Lizzie had motive, if you accept the tension over money and property. She had opportunity, if you believe the timeline and the closed house point inward. Yet the state could not bridge the gap to proof. And that's why historians still argue, because strong suspicion is not the same thing as certainty. Before we move to our conclusion, consider this. If you had been on that 1893 jury, would you have voted to convict based on what you've heard so far? Or would you have demanded something more? One piece of physical evidence that tied a person to a weapon, a garment, a room, at a precise moment in time? Hold that thought, because in our final section, we're going to step back and look at what this case tells us about justice, about gender, and about the stories that societies choose to believe. We'll bring the threads together, and I'll leave you with a question that only you can answer. Let's move into the conclusion. And so here we are, more than 130 years after those August mornings in Fall River. The case of Lizzie Borden remains one of America's most enduring mysteries. We've walked through the events, the trial, the suspects, and the evidence, or the lack of it. Lizzie herself was acquitted, but public opinion never really let her go. She lived the rest of her life in Fall River under a shadow, carrying a name that was no longer just her own but a symbol for brutality, suspicion, and unanswered questions. That perhaps is the cruelest twist of all. A courtroom declared her not guilty, yet history stamped her guilty in its own way. She never escaped the rhyme that children still chant today, or the whispers that followed her through town. Whether innocent or not, she was never free again. But this case is about more than Lizzie. It shines a light on the Victorian justice system, on its blind spots, its biases, and its limits. Could an all-male jury in 1893 truly imagine a woman committing such savage violence? Or did that very disbelief save her? The gender expectations of the time shaped both the investigation and the verdict. It's a reminder that trials aren't decided only by facts, but by the culture in which those facts are judged. And then there's the question of science. In an age before fingerprints were standard, before DNA, before luminol could reveal blood invisible to the eye, investigators were working in the dark. Imagine what modern technology might uncover if we could test that hatchet head today, or examine clothing fibers under today's microscopes. Would the case be solved once and for all? Or would it still slip through the cracks of reasonable doubt? So let me turn this to you. What do you believe? Was Lizzie Borden guilty of killing her father and stepmother? Or was she the unlucky daughter of a wealthy, unpopular man who became the easiest suspect in a desperate investigation? Do you think 21st century forensics could finally bring closure? Or is this one of those mysteries meant to remain unsolved? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your theory in the comments. Do you side with the jury of 1893, or with the court of public opinion that has never let Lizzie rest? Thank you for joining me on this journey into one of the most haunting cold cases in American history. This has been Cold Case Files, the Lizzie Borden Axe Murders. If you enjoyed this episode, subscribe so you don't miss the next mystery we unravel together. Because even after more than a century, Lizzie Borden remains an icon of the unknown.